Hello, how are you? This is one of our last chapters in the criminology course, in the final section of the course that we'll be taking on. And this last section concerns what are called typologies, different kinds of ways of organizing information about criminals and about their behavior, and organizing different types of crime. So these are useful, hopefully, to criminologists and others. That's why they've been created, so that we can get at particular aspects of crime and those who perpetrate crimes, and try to develop, for example, policy implications about the differences between the types, so as to spend money effectively and put resources into things that are going to work. And that's really the motivation behind these typologies. So the very first one that we will talk about, and that is a key topic, you can differentiate violent crime from property crime. And so this first chapter will discuss here the idea of violent crime. And right off the bat, you have a description of two different types of violence: instrumental, which is here, and expressive, which is there. Instrumental, I like to think of, means using something to achieve an end. Okay, so if you're using someone else in an instrumental manner, then you don't really care about them. You just want them for something. So instrumental violence is usually directed toward strangers, people who don't know the perpetrator, and it's something that's designed to improve the financial situation of the perpetrator. So the object is to get something from them. Expressive violence is different because it's an end in and of itself. And that means the violent is specifically so as to vent anger, rage, or frustration. So one example might be rape. Rape would be an example of expressive violence. This person isn't trying to get property or something from the individual. We've spent some time already considering some of the roots of violence, and so this particular portion goes back to some of the earlier themes we've talked about in the course. One example here, they talk about psychological abnormalities, and also they mention biological abnormalities in the same section. There's a researcher named Dorothy Otnow-Lewis who discusses how youths who kill may be suffering from multiple symptoms of psychological abnormality. And it has also been shown that death row inmates have histories of mental impairment and intellectual dysfunction. So we've already discussed these psychological abnormalities under the idea of trait theories of crime. Evolutionary factors in human instinct we haven't talked about so much, but this idea that comes from Sigmund Freud and the notion of eros versus thanatos. Eros is the life force, and thanatos is a term that Freud didn't coin himself, but it means roughly the death drive. So there are people who seek out loving and caring relationships and have an optimistic view of life, and they're experiencing eros. There are those who might have more of a negative view of people, always expect the worst from them. They may be engaged in self-destructive behaviors, and these were things that were associated for Freud with thanatos, the death instinct. So participation in violent acts or sadistic acts, for example, might be related to the roots of violence. Konrad Lorenz is also discussed as pointing out, and this is an interesting fact, that humans are one of only a very few species that engage in intra-species killing. So we're one of the few species that kills members of our own species. Substance abuse has many different potential angles with which it can be associated with violent crime. There are things like, for example, amphetamines that they talk about in your textbook, also PCP, drugs that produce violent, aggressive behaviors. Conversely, though, There are other things like, for example, alcohol, which is a depressant, and that can be linked to violence too, especially things like domestic violence. So substance abuse is rather complex as a topic. They do talk about the systemic link, which is that violence escalates when drug dealing gangs want to flex their muscle to dominate territory. So that's a systemic link between drugs and drug abuse and violence mentioned in your text. Socialization and upbringing is its own section. And we've also talked about this a little bit, the idea that children can be shown how to engage in crime, and also too that sometimes there can be problems in the home that relate to a lack of socialization for making kids healthy and in line with social norms. So one example they mention here, child abuse. It's a horrible problem that they don't have fully accurate statistics on because it's difficult to find. But there have been a number of different studies. It says children who are clinically diagnosed as abused later engage in delinquent behaviors, including violence at a rate that's significantly greater than those children who were not abused. A fellow who's discussed in that same section discusses what's called the violentization process. His name's Lonnie Athens, and there's a separate section in the text where it goes through the stages in the violentization process. The first stage is the brutalization stage. It says a young victim develops a belligerent, angry demeanor as a result of being mistreated by abusive parents. And that leads to a second stage, belligerency, where the child says, why can't I stop this violence and brutalization? Why is this happening to me? And why haven't I done anything to stop it? The third stage is the violent performance stage, which is when the youth may start to become belligerent and angry. And then the fourth stage, the virulency stage, is the idea of someone developing a criminal identity and becoming feared and enjoying the intimidation that they have over other people. Finally, also in this particular discussion, there's a concept of exposure to violence, and that research has shown that kids, for example, who are in very violent neighborhoods tend to learn from those situations. It says differences in violent crime rates between whites and racial minorities can be explained, in fact, by the latter often being forced to live in high crime neighborhoods, increasing their exposure to violence. You can also talk about the cultural values and subculture of violence thesis related to explaining violence and violent crime. This idea is that different cultures, of course, promote different ideas of how to live and what's important. So some subcultures may promote violent activity as something valued. As an example, you can think of the crime rates in Japan versus those in the United States. We in the United States value gun ownership as a freedom. In Japan, they don't. So their rates of murder tend to be a lot lower. And there have been studies about nations' gun ownership and rates of lethal violence that have kind of borne this out. There's also this consideration of subcultural norms. And a subculture is always, I like to think of it as a culture within a culture. So you can have a separate subunit within a culture with different kinds of values. And you might have, for example, differences between peer groups and what those different groups value. It says gang boys, for example, are more likely to own guns and other weapons than non-gang members. That's one example. You could talk about regional values, something that sometimes theorists have looked at as the southern subculture of violence, because in the South there's a history of slavery and also high levels of gun ownership. So regional differences between places in the United States, for example. You can also, as I mentioned a second ago, talk about national values. Some nations, it says, like the United States, Uganda, Angola, have high violence rates, and others are much more peaceful. And we can ask what's the extent to which this is attributable to things like availability of guns, but also to maybe child rearing practices, disciplinary practices, the ways that some societies approach crime and criminals. All this could be taken into consideration. As I mentioned in the previous uh, voice thread sheet, the one slide before this, the text also mentions a systemic link between drugs and violence, and that's this idea that in some instances, violent crime has been linked to the activities of drug trafficking gangs because of this idea that they are needing to conquer territory, but also, too, there's a connection if members both sell drugs and use drugs, that can also lead to violence. Rape is the next topic, and rape is something that's unique, and a lot of people confuse rape with sexual assault. But the key difference here I've underlined is that rape is a coercive act of aggression against women. The common law definition of rape in your text, it says it's the carnal knowledge of a female forcibly and against her will. So it's a crime that can only be enacted against one sex. And this may be changing. Now they're starting to look at possibly the rape of males. But until very, very recently, you should know that the definition of rape was exclusively about female victimization. One point that your textbook makes very clearly is that rape is not a forceful expression of sexuality, and this confuses people sometimes. Rape really is about something besides sex, and it's about usually power and control of someone over another, someone dominating the other person. And so that's what they mean when they say not a forceful expression of sexuality. There used to be this idea that men had so much pent-up sexual energy that they were led to this. They found over time, though, that it's more about the psychology of the individual related to how they think of power. One thing we've considered already is how crime rates are reported and some of the different ways in which they are or are not reported. Rape, of course, is a very stigmatized crime, and therefore one of the things that's rather shocking in some respects about rape is that it may not be reported in as many as 2/3 of all cases. So it's notoriously difficult to get reliable statistics on rape. And that's, again, because this is a stigmatized crime, and this is something that people may feel they won't be believed if they are to report it. They may also feel like they're not sure that it could be called rape, because sometimes people would say, well, did you put up a fight, or some things such as this. And sometimes that's a discourse that they call blaming the victim, which means that the victim is held accountable for her actions instead of looking at the perpetrator and what that individual did. So rape, the statistics are notoriously unreliable and problematic, and that's something important to think about. The history of rape. The idea with this is that in the not so long ago past, in the Middle Ages, maybe 400 or 500 years ago, women were once equated with or thought to be like property, chattel. And the idea here was that women are owned, and so it was a violation really against the man because woman was seen as the man's property. There was also some discussion here a little in your text about the practice of heiress stealing, which is basically that women who were raped could then be forced into marrying the rapist, and so that would mean that they would inherit the property, whatever property that woman was connected with. The occurrence of rape in the military is something that more people are concerned about now. That this is something that some sociologists and criminologists are studying. There are a couple of points that your text makes. One is that rape has been associated with armies and warfare for quite a long time, and women were, in some instances, considered part of the spoils of war, or something that a conquering army was entitled to do, to rape those who were conquered. You can see patterns of this happening even in the 1990s with the rape of Bosnian women by Serbian army officers. We can also talk about a typology of rape, different types of rape and different types of rapists. And some of these are pretty clear and I don't think need a lot of elaboration. Your text has information on each of these types. But gang rape versus individual rape. So rape is a collective activity versus individualized. And some sociologists and others, such as Peggy Reeves Sanday, have written about rape. Her book is called Fraternity Gang Rape, and about the process of how a gang forms an identity sometimes around the process of rape. Serial rape means someone who rapes over and over again sequentially, and these people are seen to have certain types of tendencies psychologically. Acquaintance rape is sometimes also called or including date rape. But it can also include statutory rape, which is rape of someone who's under the age of consent for sexual relations, and a rather new idea, historically, the idea of marital rape. There's a discussion here that in the past there used to be this notion of a marital exemption, and that's discussed here a little bit lower down on the slide. Basically, that at one point you could not be raped by a husband if you were married. Here is the original legal doctrine. Quote, "But the husband cannot be guilty of rape committed by himself upon his lawful wife, for their mutual matrimonial consent and contract. The wife hath given up herself in this kind unto the husband, which she cannot retract." And this was something that comes out of 16th century law. These things have changed. It says in 1980, only 3 states had laws against marital rape. Today, almost every state in the United States recognizes marital rape as a crime now. So 1980, you started to see this change in law related to a change in the status of women in society and women's rights. You can also go back a little in the slide and talk about stranger rape versus date rape. The idea of someone who's not known to the victim versus someone who is known. And date rape is particularly difficult in sometimes to prosecute because juries may assume that the person might have given consent in an unclear way or something, but because they have a previous relationship with the perpetrator, maybe more questions are brought up as to the nature of that relationship. And I mentioned statutory rape already, which is the sexual relations with someone who's under the age of consent. You could also consider typologies of rapists, different motives for different people who are engaging in rape. And there are 3 types that this fellow Nicholas Groth came up with. And these are listed in your text in a small box that says varieties of forcible rape. So the 3 types here: anger rape, sadistic rape, and power rape. Anger rape is this idea of sexuality becoming a means of expressing and discharging pent-up anger and rage. So, like the name implies, it's about pent-up anger and rage. That's a certain mentality of that type of rapist. And I want to note with you that the occurrence of that mentions in your textbook. 40% of all rapists, according to Groth, were of the anger type. The second type mentioned, the sadistic rape, It's a combination or fusion of sexuality and aggression, and it has certain kinds of characteristics. Uh, the term sadistic comes from the theories of the Marquis de Sade, who believed that hurting people can bring pleasure. And so some of the characteristics of sadistic rapists, things like ritualism, torment, and torture, are seen as exciting to the sadist. And there is also frequently some kind of characteristic that the rapist wants to harm or destroy. So a characteristic like, for example, innocence. And the percentage of rapists who are sadistic rapists, according to your textbook, only about 5%, very low. The biggest number of people who are engaged in rape are what Groth calls power rape oriented. And here, the idea is the attacker doesn't want to harm his victim as much as possess that person's sexually, possess her sexually. And so this is a different kind of characteristic than the other two. It says the goal is sexual conquest. So I'd like you to know those percentages for each of these types, which one's dominant, which one's the least likely, because those things have policy implications. You would probably want to put resources into dissuading, for example, power rape and anger rape much more so than sadistic rape, just because sadistic rape happens far less frequently. There are also some issues, which we can talk about briefly, consent and shield laws. Most people understand the notion of consent related to rape, that it's essential that you have to prove in a court of law that the attack was forced and that the victim did not give consent. And that's a crucial aspect to finding someone guilty of rape. And the trick is that that can be difficult in some instances, like, for example, date rape, because there may be a question of maybe a confusion of interpretation, or sometimes someone not necessarily understanding whether someone said no or not. So consent is a very, very crucial issue in consideration of rape. Shield laws are a fairly recent development. It says here, the idea of shield laws is so that they protect women from being questioned about their sexual history unless it has direct bearing on the case. In other words, the victim's character cannot be brought up, and she cannot be slurred or made out to be promiscuous or something such as this, because that's not something that anyone would want to go through. And if courts were allowed to do that kind of thing, that would really strongly inhibit the number of people who would come forward with rape accusations. So the shield laws help prevent that kind of exposure of someone to some kind of rehearsing of their sexual history in order to make them out to be stigmatized. And also, too, with the shield laws, there have been changes in the reporting of rape in media accounts. Quite often, the victim, her name will not be reported in media accounts as a way of also protecting the victim and her rights. Murder is the next topic under violent crime that your textbook discusses, and there's this common law definition that's offered. And common law definitions are very particular, specific words in a specific order, and I think it's important to just know them. That's one of the strange things about law, is that they're very particular about these definitions. In this instance, it's the unlawful killing of a human being with what's called malice aforethought, and we will talk about that in a minute. Degrees of murder mean that there are murders which are seen as worse or lesser types. And of course, most people know first-degree murder is the worst type of murder you can have, and it involves two things: premeditation and deliberation. It says premeditation is that the killing was considered beforehand and was motivated by more than a simple desire to just be violent. So the killing is considered beforehand. Deliberation is that the killing involved careful thought rather than impulse. So they're slightly different, but first-degree murder requires both of those. Second-degree murder is something that does not require premeditation and deliberation above, but it requires this thing, malice aforethought. And that's a different kind of notion that you want to inflict some type of grievous harm on someone. Manslaughter, the lowest level of all of these, is basically when you kill someone without malice. So let's say, for example, you drove through a crosswalk speeding, you ran a red light, someone happened to be walking the crosswalk and they died from being hit by your car. That might be prosecuted as manslaughter. Murder patterns, you also have sociologists and criminologists who look at the kind of patterns over time and the typologies of murder to try to find trends. There are some discussed in your text related to spouse relationships, and there's some interesting discussion. It says the number of unmarried men killed by their partners has declined, but the number of women killed by the men they live with, have increased dramatically. So the indication and research is that women who kill their mates do so after suffering repeated violent attacks. And if you've ever watched the film The Burning Bed, that's available at the UNK library, you might be able to find it online, but it is about a woman who suffered from domestic violence for quite a long time, who then set her house on fire, killing her spouse. There is a section in your text that gives somewhat contradictory information I want to talk to you about, and it's about whether or not murder victims know their murderer. At one point in the text it says that most murders occur among people who are acquainted. At another point it says, today more than half of murderers are strangers to their victims. So this is a complete contradiction. My understanding is that the murder by strangers is actually the one that's increasing. Finally, serial murder is the notion of someone who kills sequentially over a period of time. You can also discuss types of serial killers, and James Fox and Jack Levin are the researchers who go into this in your text. And they have come up with a three-part typology: thrill killers, mission killers, and expedience killers. The thrill killer is defined by striving for some type of sexual sadism or dominance over the victim. And this, your textbook notes, and I'd like you to note, is the most common form of serial killer. Mission killers are, it says in your text, out to try to reform the world. They want to change things. They might also have a vision that drives them to kill. And finally, expedience killers are individuals who are hoping to profit from their crime, or they perceive some kind of threat, and that's why they engage in that. So 3 different types that they found, and the most common was this idea of the thrill killer. You can differentiate serial killers from mass murderers. Serial means sequential, so one after another. Mass murder is defined as the killing of multiple people at once. So there's a key difference between those 2 types. And mass murder, there are different types that, again, Fox and Levin looked at. I'll go through these with you briefly. They're also in your text. Revenge killers, it says they're seeking to get even with either an individual or their society at large. Love mass murderers is in some ways kind of a poorly named label. They're motivated out of a warped sense of love and devotion, and they may, for example, a husband may kill his wife and child and then kill himself. That would be an example of someone who engages in mass murder out of love. Profit, there's this discussion about how sometimes people might kill people sequentially by needing to cover up a crime or some type of criminal conspiracy. And then finally, terrorism, the idea of mass murderers who are trying to send some type of message, gang killings, for example, or wanting some other, for example, political change, message of political change they want to communicate. Assault and battery have become terms that are often used together in the American justice system. They originally had slightly different definitions. I'll go through with you briefly. Assault was defined as attempted battery, which is frightening someone, the intentional frightening of someone. That's assault. Battery is the actual putting hands on someone. So assault and battery together is this idea of either threatening to harm someone or frightening them, or harming them, touching them, putting your hands on them physically. There are several different types that they go through in your text. This first one, child abuse, this one is hard to get good empirical evidence about, numbers I should say, to quantify it, because it can mean any real physical or emotional trauma to a child for which no reasonable explanation can be found. The trick is to try to figure out what are the indicators of this. For example, bruising on a child. Bruising can be caused by both being assaulted and through battery, but it can also be the result of normal everyday childhood activities, running, jumping, falling down, having accidents. So the numbers on child abuse are really hard to get in accurate counts. The agency charged with trying to get this information and do things about it, Child Protective Services, and their number that they have in the text, 2 million reports of suspected child abuse or neglect per year. And neglect means not doing things that are necessary for the interest of your child. So actual abuse is more active, doing things that harm your child. Neglect is not doing the things that a person is legally obligated to do. And if you've ever read the book A Child Called It, for example, that I believe the boy Dave Pelzer was denied food at certain points. So that would be examples of neglect. Sexual abuse, they mention a fair amount of information here. The number of reported cases is in decline, and they mention a few different reasons for this. Some cases are being overlooked because, first, there's an increased evidentiary requirement required now to substantiate cases, so they need more evidence. Second, there's an increased caseworker caution now because there are legal rights of caregivers that are being promoted. And then the third reason for maybe a decline in reporting, overlooking of these, is increased limitations on the types of cases that agencies will accept for investigation. So changes, and that may result in different kinds of numbers for reporting of sexual abuse. Parental abuse sounds strange, but the abuse of parents by children can happen, especially maybe with older parents, but also too, sometimes children can be physically larger than their parents, and so this is something that is a crime that they discuss. Spousal abuse, it's difficult again to estimate how widespread this is, because often those who are victimized will maybe change their mind about wanting to report this once police actually arrive. There is an interesting statistic in your textbook. It says 60 to 70% of all nighttime calls to police are related to domestic violence. So that gives you some indication of how very prevalent this is in U.S. society. There's also a little bit of information that says 20 to 40% of women experience violence while dating. Finally, we consider robbery, hate crimes, the occurrence of workplace violence, and stalking. And robbery, in your text, the common law definition is, quote, the taking or attempting to take anything of value from the care, custody, control of a person or person by force, and violence, and or by putting the victim in fear. So again, the technical common law definition. And the FBI records 50,000 or so robberies per year, and shows that this is something that's important and that the FBI takes seriously and records. The researcher who looked at types of robbers to some extent is this fellow Conklin. And there are 4 types. Again, this is in a separate part of your textbook that's blocked off under the category, the heading types of robbers. The professional type, it says these are robbers who have a long-term commitment to crime as a source of livelihood. And they also engage in this crime to, it says in your textbook, support a hedonistic lifestyle, a lifestyle focusing on the pursuit of pleasure. Opportunistic robbers, like the name sounds, are doing this when they see an opportunity arise. It says robbers steal to obtain small amounts of money when some type of accessible target is present. So they may steal from like cab drivers, it says drunks. In the past there was a term for this. They called people who stole from drunks jack rollers. They may steal from the elderly or some other vulnerable people. Alcoholic robbers, this is an interesting category because it says they steal perhaps when they're in a disoriented state, meaning that they have to drink perhaps in order to reduce their inhibitions to commit robbery. And they may also steal as alcoholics because they can't be employed. So some different reasons why this type of robber may exist. And then they also talk about addict robbers. Generally speaking, they are not committed to robbery, but they need it at times to come up with the money they need to meet their habit. Hate crimes are a unique and somewhat new category for crime. There's a discussion in your textbook about Matthew Shepard, and Matthew Shepard was a 21-year-old college student, I believe he was, who was attacked in Wyoming, at the University of Wyoming. He was a student there, and he was left to die, tied to one of those fences, snow fences. His killers were sentenced to life in prison. But a very evocative example of what is a hate crime. This idea that crimes can be directed toward an individual or a group where the members have some defining, discernible characteristic. So what does that mean in real terms? It means that certain groups of people are minority group members, and they usually have some kind of visible characteristic, some physical feature, their race, they're disabled, it may be their sexuality. The thing about the United States is that we have 2 contradictory, you could say, amendments that have created perhaps a need for this type of crime categorization. The First Amendment most people know, and that's the idea of freedom of expression. You can express yourself, and free speech is very much valued in the U.S. The 14th Amendment most people don't know about, or less, I should say, and that is the idea of equal protection under law. So that means that people, minority group members in particular, are protected. Their rights are protected. So the curious thing becomes, what counts as a hate crime. And why should we define certain things as hate crimes? Here's the thing. There are already penalties on the book for things like, say, vandalism, right? If you vandalize something, there's already a law against that. Hate crimes exist because they say there should be an elevated penalty for a crime against a particular group of people where that whole group of people are victimized. So if I were to go out and spray paint graffiti on a building which said something like UNK rules or something like this, right? That would be vandalism. But if I were to spray paint a swastika, that's a threat to a whole group of people and their victims, and therefore an increased penalty against that type of crime. Workplace violence, it mentions that this can be considered one of the leading causes of occupational injury and or death these days. And this is an interesting topic because sometimes workplace violence can come from external sources, and sometimes it can be internal sources. So sometimes you might have a job, like for example working within a youth correctional facility, which might involve regularly dealing with violence. Conversely, there might be jobs like, for example, a convenience store clerk, where that is not seen as part of the job or employment at all. So issues about how do you categorize workplace violence. And then finally in your text, there's a discussion about stalking, which is a relatively new crime, and a researcher named Bonnie Fisher, she researched stalking and found that 13% of women in a nationally drawn sample of over 4,000 college women were victims of stalking. So something that has emerged as a new form of crime, and something you saw a bit about how the laws developed with that video, Crime and Punishment in America, you watched earlier this term.